If someone commits a serious crime today, they get arrested, they get a lawyer, they go through a court process. They might end up in prison, doing community service, or paying a fine. Medieval justice had a completely different idea about that. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a town square sometime in the 1300s. The cobblestones are wet. The crowd around you is loud. Children are sitting on their father's shoulders to get a better view. And at the center of it all, someone is about to be executed in front of everyone. Not in a closed room, not behind prison walls, but right here, in the open air, on a perfectly ordinary afternoon. By evening, the crowd would have gone home for dinner. Tomorrow, that same square would be full of merchants again. So what did the worst punishments in medieval history actually look like, and what was the idea behind them? The strange thing about medieval punishments was that they were not really designed for the criminal, they were designed for everyone else. It goes back to a simple fact: medieval kingdoms had no budget and no bureaucracy for long-term imprisonment. Punishment had to be fast, cheap, and visible. Because the real target was never just the person being punished, it was the crowd watching. Every execution, every broken body left on public display, every burning attended by thousands of people was a message sent directly to everyone standing there. This is what happens when you mess with the law. The punishment was the spectacle, and the spectacle was the point. Hanging was medieval Europe's most ordinary execution. If someone stole enough, committed murder, or earned a death sentence from the court, chances were a rope was waiting. No elaborate preparation or special location, just a scaffold, a rope, and a crowd. It required almost nothing to carry out, which is exactly why it was used so often. Hanging was not the most dramatic punishment on this list. It was simply the most dependable, but it was considered a commoner's death. Not everyone was forced into that same spectacle. A nobleman convicted of a capital crime was beheaded. No more, no less. Beheading was a single clean blow. It was faster, considered more dignified, and far less humiliating than dangling from a scaffold. The class system in medieval Europe was also in play when it was time for punishments. How you died depended entirely on the family you were born into. A nobleman lost his head in one swipe. A commoner lost his life while struggling on a gallows. Same crime, but completely different death. Medieval justice was many things, but equal was not one of them. Same crime, completely different spectacle. But some crimes were considered worse than murder. Not because they harmed people, but because they were believed to threaten God himself. Burning at the stake was reserved for heresy. Crimes against God rather than crimes against people. Heresy could mean rejecting church teachings, preaching beliefs the church declared false, refusing to abandon those beliefs, or persuading others to follow them. Groups like the Cathars and the Waldensians were condemned for exactly that. The church condemned heretics and declared them guilty, but church law forbade clergy from shedding blood. So once the trial was over, the condemned was handed over to the secular authorities who carried out the execution. Technically, no one in holy orders did the dirty work. If you're picturing witches, you're thinking of a later period. The great witch hunts mostly belonged to the early modern age. During much of the Middle Ages, it was heretics, not witches, who were most likely to face the flames. They were the ones who filled these terrible public arenas. These executions drew enormous crowds, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. The larger the crowd, the stronger the warning. But not every punishment began with a verdict. Sometimes the punishment came before the trial could even begin. Now imagine a man is arrested for a serious crime. He's brought before the court. The judge asks him to enter a plea. Guilty or not guilty. But he says nothing. Not a word. In medieval England, staying silent had consequences. It could become a punishment in itself. The sentence was called peine forte et dure, French for strong and hard punishment. The accused was taken to a cell, laid flat on the ground, and heavy stone weights were placed on his chest one by one. The process could last for hours, sometimes days. The weights kept coming until he agreed to enter a plea, or until he died. And here is what makes this punishment one of the strangest in medieval history. Some people chose it deliberately. Dying under the weights without ever entering a plea meant they had never been legally convicted. Without a conviction, the crown could not seize their property. Their land, money, and possessions could still pass to their family. Some people willingly endured a slow, crushing death to make sure their children inherited everything. As horrifying as peine forte et dure was, it wasn't the punishment people feared most. That title belonged to something else entirely. Breaking on the wheel was one of the most feared execution methods in medieval Europe. It was used for crimes such as murder, rebellion, and, in some places, high treason. The condemned was tied to a large wagon wheel and beaten with a heavy hammer or iron bar. Every blow was intentional. They made sure they hit every bone in the body, from arms to toes. Death was not quick. It was agonizingly slow. And when it was finally over, the body was often left on display, mounted at a crossroads or city gate. The execution was finished, but the spectacle remained on display. The wheel became a monument, a warning that stayed long after the crowd went home. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely it can't get any worse than that. But it can. England reserved its most elaborate punishment for its most serious crime. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was the sentence for high treason. Not murder, not robbery, treason specifically. The condemned was hanged but cut down just before they died. Then the stomach was opened, the intestines removed and burned. After that, they were beheaded. Then the body was cut into 4 quarters and each piece sent to a different city, displayed on public gates and bridges across the country. Death was not enough. They wanted the warning to survive long after the body was gone. If medieval justice believed the punishment should fit the crime, boiling alive was its most literal example. Across medieval Europe, it was most commonly used for coin counterfeiters. The logic was simple. If you corrupted the kingdom's money, the law destroyed you in the most public and terrifying way it could. Looking back at all these brutal methods, you might wonder about the most famous torture device of them all, the Iron Maiden. The tall metal cabinet, shaped like a human figure, lined on the inside with long iron spikes. According to the story, the victim was locked inside as iron spikes pressed into the body from every direction. You have seen it in films. You have probably seen one in a museum. It feels undeniably medieval. The problem is that it almost certainly was not medieval at all. The most famous example, the Nuremberg Iron Maiden, was actually assembled in the 18th or 19th century from unrelated medieval artifacts and presented as a genuine torture device. Despite its reputation, it was never used on anyone. Nobody was ever tortured inside it. What most people picture when they imagine medieval torture was invented by people who lived centuries after the Middle Ages ended. People who wanted to make the period look more terrifying than it already was. Which is interesting because medieval Europe didn't need invented horrors. The real ones were terrifying enough. Medieval justice was not trying to change criminals. It was trying to frighten everyone else. Every public execution was a warning delivered to an entire town. The broken wheel at the crossroads, the head above the city gate, the quartered body scattered across 4 cities, the crowd walking home after another Tuesday execution. None of it was accidental. Fear was part of the sentence. So why did medieval justice look like this? Why the public scaffolds, the fires, and the scattered bodies in the town square? Because when you don't have prison walls, the crowd becomes your prison. The spectacle was the law's ultimate power. Medieval justice was never about reforming or just killing the criminal. It was about terrifying everyone who watched. It was about making sure they never forgot what they had seen.